the dictator who turned Uganda into a nightmare. In the summer of 1977, fishermen on the shores of Lake Victoria began pulling up something other than fish. Bodies, dozens of them, then hundreds, bloated and unidentifiable, snagged in nets, meant for tilapia. So many corpses drifted downstream from Uganda that officials at the Owen Falls Dam had to shut the turbines down. Human remains were jamming the machinery of a hydroelectric plant. No one officially claimed those bodies. No one dared to ask too many questions about where they came from. But everyone in Uganda knew they came from Kampala, from the basements of the State Research Bureau, from the killing fields of a regime run by a man the world had once laughed at as a buffoon, a grinning giant in a comically oversized general's uniform, self-styled as His Excellency President for Life, Field Marshal Al-Haji Dr. Idi Amin Dada, VC, DSO, MC, Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the sea, and conqueror of the British Empire in Africa in general and Uganda in particular. The world laughed. Uganda buried its dead. This is the story of how a British colonial boxer and butcher's apprentice became one of the 20th century's most notorious dictators. How he seized a nation with promise and hope, and in 8 short years turned it into one of the most efficient killing machines in modern African history. This is the story of Idi Amin. Part 1. The Making of a Soldier. To understand how Idi Amin came to power, you first have to understand the machine that built him. And that machine was not Ugandan. It was British. Idi Amin Dada Umi was born sometime in the early to mid-1920s. His exact birth year is disputed, with estimates ranging from 1923 to 1928 in the West Nile region of what was then the Uganda Protectorate. His mother, Asa Ate, was Lugbara. His father was Kakwa, a small ethnic group straddling the borders of Uganda, Sudan, and what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. Both groups were Muslim minorities in a colony where the political and economic center of gravity sat firmly with the Buganda Kingdom in the south, a Christianized, relatively wealthy, and politically privileged ethnic bloc that the British had long favored as their preferred local partners. Amin's father abandoned the family early, and Amin was raised largely by his mother, a woman locals sometimes described as a traditional herbalist and diviner, a detail that decades later feverish rumor would twist into stories that Amin's rise and brutality were the product of sorcery. In reality, his rise had a far more mundane explanation: the British Army. Amin received almost no formal education. By most accounts, he never advanced past the equivalent of a 4th grade level of literacy. What he did have was size. Amin stood somewhere around 6'4", with an athletic build that made him a formidable rugby player and, more famously, the light heavyweight boxing champion of Uganda for nearly a decade, from 1951 to 1960. He was also, by every account from those years, charming, gregarious, and possessed of an easy laugh that put people at ease, a persona that would later serve him well in disguising exactly what kind of man he was becoming. In 1946, Amin enlisted in the King's African Rifles, the British colonial regiment that recruited soldiers from across East Africa to serve, and crucially, to police the empire's colonial possessions. This was the institution that shaped him. The King's African Rifles was not simply a military unit. It was a machine specifically engineered to recruit from marginalized martial races, ethnic groups the British considered simple, loyal, and physically strong, but not politically sophisticated enough to threaten colonial rule. Northern Ugandans, including the Kakwa, Lugbara, and later the Asholi and Langi, fit this colonial stereotype perfectly. The British armed and trained them. The British did not educate them for command and did not intend for them to ever challenge British authority. Amin served with distinction by colonial standards. He was deployed to Kenya during the Mau Mau uprising of the 1950s, a brutal counterinsurgency campaign in which British forces and colonial troops were implicated in widespread torture, forced detention, and killings of suspected Mau Mau fighters and sympathizers. Amin's specific conduct during this campaign remains murky, but multiple colonial officers who served alongside him later testified that his methods for extracting information from prisoners were considered excessive even by the standards of a famously brutal counterinsurgency. On at least one occasion, he was accused of torturing suspects to death. British officers investigated. Amin was reprimanded, not discharged. The war against Mau Mau needed men like him. By the time Uganda approached independence in the early 1960s, Amin had risen to the rank of Effendi, the highest rank then available to a black African soldier in the King's African Rifles, just below commissioned officer status. When Uganda's political leaders began negotiating the terms of independence from Britain, the colonial administration faced a practical problem: an army almost entirely staffed at the officer level by British nationals, about to become the military of a sovereign nation. Someone had to be promoted, and quickly. Amin was one of only 2 Ugandans commissioned as an officer before independence. He was, by 1962, a lieutenant in what would become the Uganda Army, barely literate, trained almost exclusively in the application of force, promoted not for political judgment or administrative skill, but because the British needed a body to fill a rank. Uganda gained independence on October 9, 1962. Nobody in London or in Kampala's political establishment was thinking at that moment about what this particular soldier might do with 2 more decades of unchecked power. They should have been. Part 2. Obote's Enforcer. Uganda's first post-independence prime minister was Milton Obote, a northerner from the Lango ethnic group, who governed through an uneasy political alliance with the Kabaka, the traditional king of Buganda, Sir Edward Mutasa II. It was, from the start, a fragile arrangement, a federal patchwork stitching together a wealthy, semi-autonomous Buganda kingdom with a national government dominated by northerners who had far less economic power but increasing control of the gun. Amin's career accelerated fast under Obote. He was promoted to captain, then major, then in 1964 was made deputy commander of the army, a rise almost entirely disconnected from military merit and driven instead by Obote's need for loyal muscle. And Amin gave Obote exactly what he needed. In 1966, when Obote decided to move against his own president, the Kabaka Mutesa, and abolish Uganda's federal constitution in favor of centralized one-party rule, it was Amin who led the assault. On May 24, 1966, Amin commanded Ugandan troops in an attack on the Kabaka's palace at Mengo. Mutesa escaped over the palace wall in the dark and fled into exile in Britain, where he would die 4 years later. Hundreds of his guards and Baganda civilians were killed in the assault. Amin had proven decisively that he would do whatever violence his boss required. That same period, Amin became entangled in something that would matter enormously later: gold and ivory smuggling operations connected to rebel forces in the neighboring Congo, and, separately, a financial scandal involving army bank accounts that were found to contain far more money than Amin's salary could explain. Obote ordered an investigation. It went nowhere. Amin was simply too useful, and by then arguably already too dangerous to move against directly. Through the late 1960s, Obote's government grew more authoritarian, banning opposition parties in 1969 after surviving an assassination attempt, moving toward a socialist common man's charter, and increasingly relying on the army and on Amin personally to keep control. But the relationship between the two men was curdling. Obote had heard the rumors about the smuggling and the missing funds. He had also grown wary of Amin's habit of promoting fellow northern Muslims, particularly from Amin's own Kakwa and Nubian networks, into sensitive military posts, building, whether consciously or not, a loyal internal faction inside the officer corps that answered to Amin more than to the state. In late 1969, a gunman attempted to assassinate Obote outside a conference in Kampala. Obote survived, wounded in the jaw. Suspicion in some quarters fell, never proven, on factions close to Amin. By 1970, Obote was actively trying to sideline him, stripping some of his authority and preparing, according to multiple accounts from the period, to have him arrested on the financial corruption charges once and for all. Amin moved first. Part 3. The Coup. In January 1971, Obote flew to Singapore for a Commonwealth summit. It was a fatal miscalculation. With the president out of the country, Amin's loyalists inside the army moved to seize key installations across Kampala and Entebbe on January 25th. There was some fighting. Troops loyal to Obote resisted at several barracks, but within days the coup was complete. Obote, informed while still abroad, was refused re-entry and fled into exile in Tanzania, where President Julius Nyerere granted him asylum and would, for the rest of the decade, remain one of Amin's fiercest and most consequential enemies. What's often forgotten now, buried under everything that came after, is that Amin's coup was initially popular, genuinely, broadly popular, both inside Uganda and among Western governments watching from outside. Obote's government had grown unpopular through economic hardship, one-party rule, and heavy-handed security crackdowns. Crowds in Kampala reportedly celebrated in the streets. The exiled Baganda, still bitter over the 1966 assault on their king, initially welcomed the fall of the man who had done it, seemingly not registering or not wanting to register prisoners Obote had jailed. He arranged for the remains of the Kabaka Mutesa to be repatriated from London and given a state funeral, a gesture that won him enormous goodwill in Buganda. He spoke in his early press conferences the language of a reformer and a reluctant soldier stepping in only to restore order. Western governments, for their own strategic reasons, were quietly relieved. Obote had been drifting toward closer ties with the Eastern Bloc and had nationalized major British commercial interests in Uganda, Britain, and Israel. The latter, maintaining a military relationship with Uganda, partly as a counterweight to Arab influence in the region, were both early, if cautious, backers of the new regime. Israeli military advisors had, in fact, trained Amin's paratroopers before the coup, and some accounts suggest Israeli intelligence had at least tacit awareness the coup was coming. The promised elections never happened. Within months, the man the world had welcomed as a stabilizing strongman began revealing what he actually was. Part 4. The Purges begin. The killing started almost immediately, and it started inside the barracks. Amin understood, correctly, that the greatest threat to his new government was the army itself, specifically the significant number of soldiers who had been recruited under Obote from the Acholi and Langi ethnic groups, Obote's own northern kinsmen, who remained loyal to the exiled president. Amin's solution was systematic ethnic purging within the military. Beginning in the weeks after the coup and accelerating through 1971, Acholi and Langi soldiers were summoned to barracks under various pretexts: disarmament exercises, reorganization meetings, transfers, and then executed, often by soldiers from Amin's own ethnic networks, Kakwa, Lugbara, and West Nile Nubians, along with mercenary-style recruits brought in from southern Sudan and Zaire. At Mbarara Barracks, at Jinja, and most infamously at the barracks near the Karuma Falls on the Nile, hundreds of soldiers were murdered in mass executions, their bodies dumped into the river or into mass graves. Estimates of soldiers killed in this first wave of purges through 1971 alone range from several hundred into the low thousands. Precise numbers were never established because record-keeping and accountability were, by design, among the first casualties. State Research Bureau cells, tortured, and in a great many cases, never seen again. Chief Justice Benedicto Kiwanuka, the first black African to serve as Uganda's Chief Justice, a man who had ruled against the government in a habeas corpus case, was dragged from his courtroom in September 1972 by State Research Bureau agents and murdered. The Anglican Archbishop of Uganda, Janani Luwum, would meet the same fate 5 years later, in 1977, after he and other religious leaders wrote to Amin protesting the killings. His death officially ruled a car accident, an explanation almost no one believed. Part 5. The Economic War and the Expulsion of the Asians. In August 1972, Amin made the announcement that would define his international reputation for the rest of his life and cripple Uganda's economy for a generation. Uganda's Asian community, the expulsion, was framed publicly as an economic war, a redistribution of wealth from a supposedly exploitative foreign merchant class to indigenous Ugandans. In reality, it was catastrophic economic vandalism. Asian-owned businesses, farms, factories, and properties representing the backbone of Uganda's commercial economy were seized and handed out, often as personal patronage to Amin's military and political allies, many with no experience running the enterprises they now controlled. Within a few years, Shops sat empty or collapsed, manufacturing output cratered, and Uganda's economy, once one of the more promising in East Africa, began a decline from which it would not recover for decades. The expulsion also drew international condemnation and cost Amin the diplomatic tolerance he had briefly enjoyed from Britain, which was forced to absorb tens of thousands of the expelled Ugandan Asians as British passport holders. But domestically, at least in the short term, the expulsion was genuinely popular with segments of the population who had long resented Asian economic dominance. A reminder that Amin's brutality and his populism were not separate phenomena. They reinforced each other. Fear kept people silent. Moments of ethnic and economic grievance settling, however destructive, kept a murderer more as an eccentric buffoon good for a headline. That perception was never stopped. Estimates from human rights organizations, the International Commission of Jurists, and later scholarly research placed the death toll of Amin's 8-year rule somewhere between 100,000 and 500,000 Ugandans killed, a range so wide precisely because the regime destroyed or never kept the records that would allow a more precise count. Entire earlier relationship with Israel after Israel declined to supply him with fighter jets for a planned invasion of Tanzania, and pivoted openly toward the Arab world and toward praise in public statements for the Palestinian cause, statements that at points included open admiration for Adolf Hitler and the Holocaust, remarks that permanently marked him as an international pariah among most Western governments, even as some non-aligned and Arab states continued engaging with him. Part 7. Entebbe. On June 27, 1976, an Air France flight from Tel Aviv to Paris, carrying 248 passengers, was hijacked shortly after a stopover in Athens by a combined cell of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and members of the German revolutionary cells. The hijackers diverted the plane to Entebbe International Airport in Uganda, and Amin, far from acting as a neutral host, personally welcomed the hijackers, provided them with additional weapons and Ugandan soldiers to help guard the hostages, and allowed the old airport terminal to be used as a holding facility. Over the following days, non-Jewish and non-Israeli passengers were released, roughly 100 hostages, overwhelmingly Israeli and Jewish passengers, along with the Air France crew who refused to abandon them, were held as the hijackers demanded the release of dozens of imprisoned militants. Amin, visiting the terminal repeatedly in what hostages later described as a mixture of menace and theatrical bravado, made clear his government was aligned with the hijackers' aims, not merely a passive location for the crisis. On the night of July 3rd to 4th, 1976, Israeli commandos executed one of the most famous special forces operations in modern history, Operation Thunderbolt, popularly remembered as the raid on Entebbe. Israeli C-130 transport planes flew nearly 2,500 miles, undetected, to land at Entebbe under cover of darkness. In an assault lasting under an hour, Israeli commandos stormed the terminal, killed the hijackers and a number of Ugandan soldiers guarding them, and rescued all but a handful of the hostages. 3 hostages died during the raid, and a fourth, an elderly hostage named Dora Bloch, who had been hospitalized separately in Kampala before the raid, was murdered afterward on Amin's direct orders in an act of retaliation. The raid's sole Israeli fatality was the mission's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Yonatan Netanyahu, the older brother of Israel's future Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. The raid was a profound humiliation for Amin. A foreign military force had flown into his own airspace, destroyed roughly a quarter of intelligence officers believed to have leaked information to Israel, were executed,